the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, this is NATO 2020, a new podcast series pitching fresh ideas for the world's oldest military alliance. I'm your host, Terry Schultz, and I've been covering NATO a long time, so I know a lot about how it's been doing things, but this series is about how it could be doing things differently. The Atlantic Council commissioned a series of 20 recommendations, trying to give NATO some new ideas about how to handle the threats that definitely get more creative all the time. Some of these ideas are things we've heard before, and some of them are brand new. All of them are aimed at helping NATO battle into the next decade with more tricks of the trade. In this episode, the recommendation is listen to women. Our guest is Cori Fleser, who is a National Security Policy Analyst with Booz Allen Hamilton, who also supports the implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 with the U.S. military. And she is also the U.S. representative to NATO's 2030 Young Leaders Group. With all of that bringing you in, Cori, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Terry. I am super excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's a great topic, and we could always say it's very relevant, but I think it's just past its 20th birthday, so we are definitely due for a discussion about the Security Council Resolution 1325. I'm just going to summarize it briefly so everyone's on the same page with what we're talking about. So the resolution passed in October 2000. And I'm reading here, reaffirms the important role of women in the prevention and resolution of conflicts, peace negotiations, peace building, peacekeeping, humanitarian response, and in post-conflict reconstruction. It also stresses the importance of their equal participation and full involvement in all efforts for the maintenance and promotion of peace and security. It goes on a bit further, but I think those are the main points. So 21 years ago, when Resolution 1325 was passed, Cori, where do you think people thought we would be today compared to where we are now? Because when I think about women in conflict situations, they're still bearing the brunt of it. Rape is still used as a weapon of war despite having been prosecuted. Sometimes it's hard to be optimistic.
Yeah, you raise a really good point. So I think, the global community likely thought that we would be a lot farther along given how much time has passed. But when we think about it in particular from the defense and security institutions, which were a little bit slower on the uptake than our defense and development counterparts, we've made great considerable progress, but at the same time, challenges remain. For example, we have done a great job in identifying those areas of policy or doctrine to really highlight the importance of women, peace, and security to national security, but also then implementing those policies has been particularly challenging because it's just been a little slower from the leadership standpoint. We're still lacking in some resources, and it is still one of these areas that I think is not totally recognized as critical to the global security environment. And I think today when we talk about the complex nature of security and even looking forward, to what security will look like in the future, the Women, Peace, and Security mandate is really one of those areas that can help us speak to getting after the different root causes of instability, addressing things like cybersecurity and great power competition, all these different areas that come up that we're looking forward to in the future. I think this is one of these agendas that's just going to help us get after those.
But when you say things like, the doctrines have been written, or, you're using a lot of lingo that doesn't actually, to me, say anything in practical terms. So what do you mean when you talk about what progress has been made? What can you show me tangibly that's different since the year 2000 when the resolution was created?
100% a fair point. And I think it's one of those things that, when you talk to people who are in the midst of women, peace, and security implementation, all of us talk in jargon. And so I do appreciate your point that it's really important to say, what does that actually mean to those people who don't work day to day on this stuff? 100% got you. So NATO, militaries around the world are hierarchical organizations that are really top-down driven. And so I think some of the first things that we put into place were policy guidance that explained to militaries what they were responsible for doing and what constituted the Women, Peace, and Security agenda to security organizations. When we look at the overarching pillars of participation, protection, prevention, and access, and you start translating those into security sector language, we look at the participation of women in the security sector. So how do we get more women involved, not only as service members, but also into leadership and senior leader decision-making roles? And how do we advance that and remove those barriers for their access to those security sector roles? In terms of protection and prevention, we think about this from how do you protect civilians better? How do you think through in advance how to make military action not upend the civilian livelihoods of those people in that environment? How do you protect women and girls better? And what is the military's role in protecting or preventing women and girls from experiencing sexual and gender-based violence? How do you improve access for women and girls as well as men and boys when you're delivering humanitarian assistance? What is the actual role of the military given their, their authorities and their resources and their mission areas? What tasks and activities are they supposed to do? And so when we talk about the successes, I think that's really one of the things we've seen is those overarching policy guidelines that have established those kinds of tasks and then started establishing training for either gender advisors or military personnel to implement those tasks when they're planning missions, when they're in operational environments working with civilians, or when they're doing some of their day-to-day staff work, I believe.
That was really helpful. That's exactly what I wanted to know. But
thank you.
That's really helpful. But having said that, now I think, okay, 21 years to write new guidelines. I mean, what you're saying, and I'm not saying there hasn't been any progress on the ground, but while the first step may be to explain to everyone what kind of responsibilities they have now, maybe I'm impatient, but I would have liked to also see once they're explained, but would have liked to see them then have more impact once everybody understands what they need to do.
Yeah, I agree with you because I think there's a lot of people out there who wanted to see more impact. They wanted to see more change in institutions, but I also think that some of these things do actually take time. When we think about cultural change, which is what Women, Peace, and Security is sometimes advocating for, is for people to look at and have empathy for some of the different experiences of women and girls within the context of security. And when you look at security sector institutions, they're mostly male dominated. And sometimes the empathy and the understanding for the lived experiences of women and girls is a little bit more difficult for men who have been working in security sectors. And that's okay. But actually, I think we can change that now. We can actually adjust and adapt and make sure that when they are in sort of these institutions and thinking through what they're planning for an operation, that they do think through with some empathy and consideration for those different lived experiences. And that's kind of like the crux of the issue, I think, sometimes when we talk about how slow change is.
You're right. That's not nothing at all. But think about how broad the resolution is, because you're not only talking about these institutional changes, which will help in the long run about decision making and the kind of tactical and practical decisions that are made coming out of institutions. But you're also talking about, as I mentioned at the beginning, the situation of women who are caught up in conflict, or sometimes even the targets of the conflict. How can one resolution bridge all of those necessary goals? And you really have talked mostly about the institution. What about the situation of women in conflict? We've got a 10-year war in Syria that's absolutely devastated families and children and women. I mean, there hasn't been any progress in that at all. And I mean, think about, the girls' school children who are being stolen, and being put through absolute hell. There are some circumstances that really come to mind that are absolutely just devastating, disproportionately to women.
Yeah, I think one of the most powerful things about the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda is how it has transformed our understanding of these diverse roles that women and girls play before, during, and after conflict. I think historically there might have been this binary understanding where women are inherently peaceful and men are inherently warring, which we now know is absolutely not true. And in fact, we've sort of highlighted different areas like women as foreign terrorist fighters or women as critical enablers of violent extremist organizations, where these are groups of women who aren't inherently peaceful, but they are actively participating in a security issue. And so the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda, I'm quite thankful for enhancing our collective understanding of these diverse roles that women can play. both to prevent and respond to conflict in a more inclusive way, but also as these enablers for different entities that might undermine our security and might be causing instability in certain areas. And so I think that's one of the huge successes of this agenda.
That wasn't exactly the angle I was getting at, but it's an important one. I mean, I meant more about, has the implementation of more awareness about women, and the needs of women on the institutional side that you addressed first, made any difference on women as the main victims of conflict? I mean, was it intended to change that? Can it?
So yes, I think there's an inherent relationship between increasing women's participation in diversifying defense institutions and the ability of militaries to uniquely engage women and girls in a way that gets more of an understanding of how conflict has disproportionately harmed or affected them. And what I mean by this is having a diverse military. What we do know and what we accept is that, diversity of teams helps create different innovative ways to addressing conflict or addressing national security challenges. That's why we advocate for more women, more leadership positions, more people of color, more people from different backgrounds, more LGBTQIA folks, because that brings a diversity of experience to the global security environment and its challenges that maybe we wouldn't be getting if we just had the same people of one background thinking about a national security problem. I think from a military perspective in particular, having more women as well allows us to tailor teams so that we can have appropriate engagement with women that is reflective of some of the constraints on the ground from a cultural perspective. It's something that NATO learned in particular in Afghanistan, where it wasn't able to engage with women and girls because it didn't have any female forces on the ground who could appropriately engage those women, appropriately search those women in particular, and really figure out what it is that the operation in that area needed to do to understand its impact on those women, but what it could provide for them in terms of security. So that was absolutely huge. And I think nowadays we're seeing if you can increase the numbers of women and you have trained and qualified women in these positions, it not only diversifies how you look at security and gives you a unique perspective, but it also sets you up to have a more flexible capability when you do want to engage folks on the ground. You have ready, trained women who can safely engage with those people. And so it does contribute to some of the operational effectiveness pieces that Women, Peace, and Security has helped from a security sector perspective.
Yeah, that's definitely interesting. And I do want to talk about Afghanistan as a case in itself, but I wanted to go into this right now, though. How receptive, from your experience in trying to implement 1325, how receptive is, for example, the U.S. military, which is what I presume you know best, not speaking for other countries, but and I'm not at all presuming that it's only men who may be resistant to these policies. Are these things that people either sort of discount because they either think it's not a problem or it's already been achieved or they're against them? And how, not that you were there 20 years ago, but how would, some of us were, don't laugh. But how would you guess over the last 20 years that this has changed, if at all?
So, when you take a topic called women, peace, and security, and you talk about it to military people, in my experience, there was a lot of folks that really only understood the security aspect of it. They didn't understand why I was talking to them about women or about peace, because from their perspective, that is not the responsibility of a defense institution. And that's just where we stood at the time. I think what I have seen change, however, is that there are folks who did deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan who understood that there were challenges in engaging women on the ground there. They understood that, maybe U.S. forces that were engaging women were making men very angry, and maybe that there were different types of security threats that were missed because men were dressing up like women who were fully covered and they weren't properly searched or investigated. And so they have these very personal experiences coming back to their roles in the military in the U.S. That have highlighted what is a tiny example for the broader women, peace, and security agenda. So when I encounter these people in their roles in the military today, and I can tune into one of those experiences, that is where I see people sort of changing their perspective on the necessity of what comes down through, a global agenda or for the U.S. policy and legislation guidance. And so that's where you take this higher overarching thing that is very jargony and what does it mean to the military? And these military folks already have these experiences where women, peace, and security was happening, and they know now they can sort of connect that experience to this higher overarching agenda. And so that is some of the area that I think can further be expanded upon. Those lessons learned are the ones that you can really take and reapply it to other contexts. So if you look at the African continent and different parts of the African context, when you're trying to engage women and girls on the ground, having civil military teams that are mixed teams of men and women have proven to be slightly more successful in engaging some of them because of the similar dynamic.
So basically what you're saying is some people are beginning to understand the importance of it purely for practical reasons, and others will sort of believe in it for the moral appropriateness of equality and things like this. But people are getting there slowly but surely. Am I reading that correctly?
100%. People definitely are getting there either through their own personal experience, through deployments. Some people are being told to do it through policy or plans, which is not a horrible way for a military to compel change. It's happened before. It'll do it again. And some other folks actually genuinely understand that, gender equality is the direction that we're moving as a global community, and the security sector plays a role in that. And so they're super invested in making sure that they personally can contribute to that in any way that they're able to.
Without making a political statement about this, but simply objectively, did the last 4 years of the Trump administration prove a setback for this? Because, for example, it was so shocking to me that some recommendations for promotions were held up because the administration itself would have been likely to reject them, or bringing back kicking out people of different gender persuasions, it's sort of just a lack of appreciation for diversity surely hurts women as well in the military. And that's what we saw under the Trump administration.
Yes, it was certainly difficult due to some of the restrictions on language that we were able to do. There wasn't as much of a consideration for intersecting identity. Language. Yes, language. For example, it was a little contentious to be able to say the term gender in the military at the time. So, with the rescinding of the transgender policy that had been pushed out in the previous administration, I had to do a lot of one-on-ones on the relationship of women, peace, and security, the role of the gender advisor to that transgender policy. Other types of language that were a little difficult were talking about the intersecting identity characteristics. So women, peace, and security uniquely highlights gender as this key component for understanding security. And what I mean by that is that men, women, boys, and girls, based on who you are and where you come from, and the gender roles and responsibilities that are part of that community, that'll impact the way that you experience some sort of dynamic of conflict. And so it was quite hard to address the fact that gender and race might intersect to make somebody more vulnerable in a certain context, or gender, race, and ethnicity, gender, race, ethnicity, and sexuality, all these different sort of intersecting identity characteristics that are super important when we're looking at populations of people to understand power dynamics, to understand key stakeholders for different types of action that we might plan. It was a little difficult to start talking about that complexity in the last administration. The flip side to that is that it was the Trump administration that signed the Women, Peace, and Security legislation from a U.S. perspective. So codifying women, peace, and security as U.S. legislation was absolutely huge. We're one of the only countries in the world that has U.S. national legislation on women, peace, and security. And from there was a U.S. strategy that was made. So while there were certain challenges, I do have to say that legislation was one of those elements that really did keep our global agenda on women, peace, and security moving in the United States, while the administration politicized certain things that would have supported it more.
So you may have had to tread water, but all was not lost because you then had this new weapon or this new mechanism to use to push it forward.
Yeah, I think in the last administration, there was a lot of focus on women's participation without looking at the broader complexity of women, peace, and security to apply a gender perspective and understand how to do prevention of sexual and gender-based violence better, to protect civilians, specifically women and girls, better, and to, enable access to relief and recovery. These things weren't talked about as part of security sector mission sets as frequently as women's participation was in the previous administration. And so that kind of kept us in a little box over here on women's participation, instead of looking for other ways of better protecting civilians, establishing roles and responsibilities for military forces on sexual exploitation and abuse. These were sort of the things that were a little bit more challenging.
Okay, well, hopefully you can sort of gain back some ground. But one of the places that I know that you and so many other people will be worried about is Afghanistan. And I've been going there for 20 years. And I know that women there are absolutely terrified right now. And there's no way out of it because the Biden administration is certainly not going to reverse withdrawal plans, whether it's 2 months or 6 months or 8 months, it's going to happen. And women there are so terrified, and they have not been fully vested in the peace process and don't expect to be, and have a lot of fears. So is this going to be one of the examples brought up as a semi-failure with women, peace, and security? I mean, we don't even know how bad it's going to be when the U.S. is gone, but we know that the people who are going to be made most vulnerable by this are definitely women.
100%. I think we do know that Afghanistan is one of the most challenging places to be a woman or a girl. We know that there are high maternal mortality rates, there's endemic gender-based violence, and there's very limited access to education, healthcare, political office. These are all still challenges that women and girls face. But still, I think
and that the U.S. said it was fighting for. That's the other thing, and that the U.S. has made one of its goals.
And so for me in particular, I think about it from the security perspective, and specifically from the security sector perspective. You look at all these issues that have happened, but then you look at the work that ISAF has accomplished and then transitioning into the Resolute Support Mission, and really with the work of their gender office to focus on the recruitment and retention of women inside of the defense forces and the police. I think let's start with the challenges, let's start with the positives here. Let's go with positive things first. They have made progress in increasing the number of women in both the security forces and the police force. They have figured out how to make training and language training accessible and basically build up the skill sets of women to be serving in these roles in the security sector. I think the flip side to that is that we're still sort of challenged by women serving in those roles at an increased likelihood of violence and retaliation from the Taliban because they're serving in the security sector, which is, considered a male-dominated sector. So, I think was it recently last year that there was there was a woman. She was a colonel.
She was a pilot.
Police force. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, it was the pilot.
Yes. There's all these instances of these women who are success stories from the U.S.'s perspective of integrating into the armed forces or the security sector, rising through the ranks, becoming these leaders, and then being targeted by the Taliban, which quite frankly doesn't incentivize further integration. And so while we have increased numbers, we're not solely measuring success, I think, of women, peace, and security in Afghanistan by numbers of women anywhere. We need to look at their comprehensive security, their access to resources that either help them participate in the economy, allow them access to healthcare to, keep them healthy, keep them safe. They're this sort of comprehensive approach that maybe hasn't been as successful in certain areas as it has been in others. That really is going to just continue to be one of those areas we have to keep working on, I think.
But even in countries that should be much better, I'm in Stockholm right now, and they've just gotten the first woman head of the Navy. I mean, even in Scandinavia, these are countries where the women first got the right to vote, and usually really have high levels of gender equality, and it's not even happening here inside the military that you have female leaders. So if these role model countries aren't doing better, how can we expect Afghanistan to do better?
Sure. I'm a big fan of not comparing success on women, peace, and security across countries because there are certain privileges that certain countries have that others don't. And everybody kind of tackles women, peace, and security a little bit more differently based on their own politics and their own sociocultural context. For Afghanistan in particular, I think there's context there that we can't measure certain successes by integration of women into the security sector, because that's not a socioculturally sort of accepted or viable option, I think. But when we look at the number of women that have increased from the village level to the national level in politics or in leadership positions, we're seeing more women over the last 20 years in Afghanistan. I think when we look at laws and legal frameworks, I think that's also another area where there have been some successes putting in equality policies or legislation between men and women in Afghanistan. Again, implementation is everything, but getting those sort of legal frameworks is one of those other areas. So yeah, I hear you that it's hard to say that even for model countries that have a lot of resources, that have senior leadership support, that have the appearance of more gender equality or equity between men and women, they're still struggling there. But I think looking at Afghanistan and really comparing Afghanistan today to Afghanistan in 2001 is helpful for understanding where there have been successes and where there's probably room for growth and improvement. I think it will still be a long road, but we absolutely can't give up on Afghanistan, particularly for the women and girls there who we've supported for the last 2 decades.
Well, that's a whole nother episode when we talk about withdrawal of U.S. troops, where there will not be the same kind of pressure on local authority. It's not just the Taliban. It's not just the Taliban. Yeah.
100%.
Yeah. But anyway, that's perhaps not a complete loss, but certainly the fear of a loss. And I want to wrap up going back to NATO headquarters, because it's a challenge there as well. I mean, we've only had one Deputy Secretary General who was female, the beloved Rose Gottemuller, and she was replaced by a man. There's not likely to be a woman. I mean, at least I haven't heard rumors yet of any women in the running to take over when the current Secretary General leaves next year. So that will have been, again, there aren't a lot of women in high-ranking positions there. It's not very visible, even with a Secretary General who is an avowed feminist, and not shy about it. So they haven't done as well as they should. Yet when we see groups like the Young Leaders Group that you are part of, I don't know what the gender balance was there, but there were a lot of young ladies, right? So do we just have to wait for your generation to move into these positions? I mean, how can we, in a short term, so it doesn't take another 20 years, how can we start seeing change in a place that should be able to do it, like NATO headquarters?
Having more senior leaders of multilateral organizations state that they are feminist, I think, is a great start. And these are certainly the conditions for success. But yes, there are still challenges. And I think I don't want to have to wait for our generation to become in power before we start seeing change. And so a few things that would expedite that, in addition to some of the policies that we've already talked about, include resources and prioritization. Women, peace, and security is not the most resourced issue on the agenda, if you will. It is lacking funding for dedicated personnel. Even though we've seen increases over the last decade, there's still lacking personnel that are dedicated to support the implementation of the Women, Peace, and Security guidance. Resources for also training as well, I think, is another one of those areas where we can always have more training, but more resources to dedicate and tailor training so that it's not necessarily that you're training somebody on women, peace, and security as the overarching policy issue, but you've identified that subtopic that supports women, peace, and security that's relevant to the thing they're being trained on. So if you're training intelligence officers, you're training them on the concept of gender and how it's important in their intelligence analysis. I think there's also sometimes a misunderstanding of women, peace, and security as relevant to the goals and missions of NATO. I think that the special representative to the Secretary General on Women, Peace, and Security has done a great job at elevating the alliance's understanding. But again, I think when we look down at implementation through the rank structure, there's probably a middle area of officers that would benefit from a better, more enhanced understanding of women, peace, and security, and specifically the tasks that they need to do. Finally, I'd offer that the Gender Advisor Network that exists in NATO is working hard, and they're a passionate community of folks who I think work every day to make sure that NATO kind of understands its roles, responsibilities, and functions for implementing women, peace, and security. And so I think that, not over relying on the gender advisors, but enhancing the understanding of the military staffs and the militaries that support the alliance. That's one of those areas that I think we'll start seeing change happen.
Well, that is a somewhat optimistic note to end on anyway. Just reminding NATO that it's everybody's job and that they have a big role to play as the leading international institution for peace and security. So I think that's and I really think that the Young Leaders Group was a really good example of what it could look like if people worked hard, adding 10 years to your ages or so, 10, 20 years. So thank you. I'm really thrilled that you were part of that group in getting to have you here today. So Cori Fleser, thank you so much for taking time out of maternity leave. We should point out to come on our episode and talk to us about this very important issue, listen to women. And I hope everybody did listen to you. So thank you for giving us your precious time today. And all of the recommendations for the NATO 2020 series are available on atlanticcouncil.org. So we hope you'll check them all out and tell us what you think on Twitter at #StrongerWithAllies. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you next time.